Pay me in, what do you call them, Granny?
Million.
What if one of America's most beloved sitcoms hid 15 shocking facts that completely change how you see it? The Beverly Hillbillies wasn't just comedy, it was a chain of decisions that made stars and quietly ruined them. Each fact reveals something deeper, and by the end, nothing feels the same. Number 1. Jethro was smarter than everyone thought, and that became his biggest trap. Jethro Bodine built his entire identity around being proudly 6th grade educated, and audiences accepted that identity without question because the show conditioned them to see him that way, but behind that exaggerated simplicity was a contradiction that exposes how Hollywood really works. Because Max Baer Jr., the man behind Jethro, wasn't naive or limited at all. He held a business degree and understood production, financing, and audience behavior with a level of clarity that many executives later failed to recognize. Yet once millions of viewers locked him into the image of Jethro, that image became more powerful than reality itself. And from that point forward, casting directors weren't evaluating Baer as an actor, they were reacting to a memory they couldn't separate from the man, which meant every audition began with a disadvantage he couldn't control. So instead of waiting for the industry to change its perception, he changed his strategy entirely and moved into producing where results mattered more than image. And that shift revealed something uncomfortable, because once he operated outside the system, he proved he was capable of generating success that contradicted everything Hollywood assumed about him, which creates a clear pattern. The stronger his performance became, the more it limited his opportunities. And the very thing that made him unforgettable also made him difficult to cast, forcing him into independence, where he ultimately found more control and financial success than most actors ever achieve, turning what looked like a limitation into an advantage that only existed because the system failed to see him clearly in the first place. Number 2. Granny wasn't old, she was a masterclass in physical illusion. Granny Clampett didn't simply appear elderly. She embodied the accumulated weight of time in a way that felt almost unsettlingly real. And that authenticity wasn't something that came naturally from age, it was the result of sustained, deliberate physical control, because Irene Ryan was only marginally older than Buddy Ebsen. Yet on screen, she projected the presence of someone from an entirely different generation. And that gap wasn't created through makeup alone, it was engineered through posture, rhythm, and precision, as she locked her body into a hunched structure that had to be maintained for hours, slowed her movements with calculated restraint, and delivered her lines with a sharp, unfiltered authority that suggested lived experience rather than performance. And what made it even more striking was how instantly that illusion could dissolve. Because the moment filming ended, Ryan could straighten her back, adjust her gait, and visibly shed decades in seconds, a transformation that crew members often described as watching two identities switch places in real time, revealing that the character wasn't something she stepped into casually, it was something she actively held together moment by moment. But that level of commitment created an unintended consequence, because the more convincing Granny became, the more the industry stopped seeing Irene Ryan as a versatile performer and began seeing her as a fixed image. And once that perception solidified, it limited her ability to move beyond the role, illustrating a recurring truth in television that when an illusion becomes too complete, it can redefine not only how audiences see the character, but how the industry sees the actor behind it, turning mastery into a form of confinement. Number 3. Granny's cookbook blurred the line between fiction and reality. At a surface level, a cookbook tied to a television character might seem like a predictable extension of popularity, something designed to capitalize on audience attachment without adding real depth. But Granny's cookbook didn't function that way because Irene Ryan didn't approach it as herself. She fully inhabited the character in written form, crafting every line in Granny's voice with the same tone, worldview, and personality that audiences had already internalized, and that decision fundamentally changed how the book was perceived. Because instead of feeling like merchandise, it felt like a continuation of the character's existence beyond the screen, and that shift created a different kind of engagement, where readers weren't just following recipes, they were interacting with a familiar presence, and the content reinforced that connection by blending humor with authenticity, combining exaggerated, sometimes absurd instructions with genuine Southern cooking traditions rooted in real cultural practices, which created a layered experience where entertainment and reality coexisted without undermining each other. And that balance is what made the cookbook effective, because it didn't break the illusion, it extended it into everyday life, proving that when a character is constructed with enough depth and consistency, it can move across formats without losing credibility. And in doing so, it revealed that the Beverly Hillbillies wasn't just telling stories, it was building a world that audiences were willing to step into, interact with, and even bring into their own homes. Number 4. Uncle Jed was technically wrong but emotionally correct. On paper, Jethro referring to Jed as uncle doesn't align with strict genealogical accuracy, and from a purely technical standpoint, it could be labeled as a continuity error, but correcting it would have undermined something far more important than precision, because in many rural communities, titles like uncle and aunt function as expressions of respect and familiarity rather than exact definitions of family structure, and that distinction matters because it reflects how people actually communicate within those environments, meaning the show made a conscious choice to prioritize authenticity of behavior over technical correctness, and that decision preserved the natural rhythm of the dialogue, because forcing the characters to use precise relational terms would have made their speech feel artificial and disconnected from the world they were meant to represent. And this reveals a broader principle embedded in the series, that realism isn't always about factual accuracy. It's about emotional truth, about capturing how relationships feel rather than how they are diagrammed. And by allowing that small inconsistency to remain, the show maintained a sense of lived-in credibility that supported its larger themes, reinforcing the idea that the Clampetts operated on instinct and connection rather than rigid systems, which ultimately made them more believable than if every detail had been technically perfect, demonstrating that sometimes what appears to be an error is actually a deliberate choice that protects the integrity of the story. Number 5. Mr. Drysdale's struggle happened quietly, but it changed everything. Raymond Bailey's performance as Mr. Drysdale depended on precision, because the character's humor was built on tightly controlled reactions, escalating panic, and timing that had to land exactly right to sustain the rhythm of each scene. But over time, subtle disruptions began to emerge, starting with small inconsistencies like missed cues or delayed responses that gradually became more noticeable. And while the audience didn't immediately understand what was happening, the production did, and instead of removing Bailey or drawing attention to the issue, they adapted around him by restructuring scenes, simplifying dialogue, and shifting more responsibility onto surrounding characters to maintain pacing, which allowed the illusion of continuity to remain intact even as the reality behind it shifted. And that decision reflects a deeper form of loyalty within the production, prioritizing the preservation of the character over efficiency or replacement, but it also reveals how fragile long-term success can be, because the audience continued to see the same confident banker they had always known, unaware of the adjustments happening behind the scenes, and by the time the series concluded, Bailey's condition had progressed to the point where continuation was no longer sustainable, leading to a quiet exit that contrasted sharply with the character's larger-than-life presence, highlighting the gap between the permanence of what audiences remember and the vulnerability of the people who create it. Number 6. The original time travel concept would have destroyed the show. Before the Beverly Hillbillies became the show audiences, remember, its earliest concept involved a pioneer family transported into the modern world through time travel, which on the surface seems like a creative way to amplify contrast. But in practice, it would have introduced structural limitations that could have restricted the show's long-term growth, because time travel requires internal rules, explanations, and consistency that must be maintained across episodes, creating a framework that forces the narrative to constantly justify itself. And that burden would have shifted focus away from character interaction and toward maintaining logic, which directly conflicts with the kind of fluid, character-driven comedy the show ultimately relied on. So by removing that element and replacing it with a simple oil discovery, the creators eliminated unnecessary complexity and made the premise immediately understandable, allowing the culture clash to exist without explanation, which in turn shifted the emphasis from how the characters arrived to how they reacted, and that shift created flexibility, enabling the show to evolve naturally over time without being constrained by its own setup, demonstrating that simplifying a concept doesn't reduce its strength. It often enhances it by removing barriers. And in this case, that decision transformed what could have been a short-lived gimmick into a sustainable format that allowed the series to grow, adapt, and ultimately define an entire era of television comedy. Number 7. The Clampetts truck became more valuable than its own joke. The Clampetts truck began as a visual joke, designed to instantly communicate the family's rural background through its overloaded, unstable appearance. But over time, it evolved into something far more meaningful, because every element attached to it reinforced continuity, reminding viewers that despite their sudden wealth and new environment, the Clampetts themselves had not changed, and that consistency transformed the truck from a simple prop into a symbolic anchor that carried the identity of the show, making it instantly recognizable even outside the context of specific episodes. And decades later, when one of the original vehicles resurfaced, its value wasn't tied to functionality or condition, but to its connection to the narrative, because collectors weren't purchasing a vehicle, They were acquiring a tangible piece of television history, and that shift illustrates how objects connected to storytelling can accumulate meaning over time, eventually redefining their worth entirely, turning something intentionally designed to appear worthless into something highly valuable, and that transformation reflects a broader truth about entertainment. That meaning is built gradually, reinforced through repetition and emotional connection until it becomes strong enough to outlast the original context, making the truck not just a relic, but a lasting symbol of the show's cultural impact. Number 8. Jethro was a risk that proved the show would experiment. The introduction of Jethro's twin sister portrayed through a combination of physical performance and separate voice work, wasn't just a comedic addition, it was an experiment in how far the audience's suspension of disbelief could be pushed, because the execution required viewers to accept multiple layers of illusion at once, with Max Baer Jr. embodying the character physically, while another performer supplied the voice, creating a hybrid portrayal that depended on coordination rather than realism, and initially, that novelty aligned with the show's exaggerated tone, allowing the concept to function within its comedic framework. But as time passed, the limitations became clear, because the humor relied heavily on the gimmick rather than on character development, making it difficult to sustain engagement over multiple episodes, which ultimately led to the character's removal. And that decision reveals something important about the production, that it was willing to take creative risks even if they didn't result in long-term success, understanding that experimentation was necessary to prevent stagnation. And while Jethro didn't remain a permanent part of the series, the attempt itself demonstrated a flexibility that helped keep the show dynamic, proving that not every idea needs to endure to be valuable, as long as it expands the boundaries of what the audience is willing to accept. Number 9. The theme song didn't just introduce the show, it rewired an entire genre. Most television theme songs are designed to fade into the background the moment an episode begins, serving as a brief introduction before the real narrative takes over, but the Ballad of Jed Clampett disrupted that convention entirely, because instead of acting as background, it functioned as a fully self-contained narrative that delivered the entire premise before a single scene unfolded, and that structural choice had immediate consequences for how audiences engaged with the show, as viewers didn't need time to interpret characters or context. They were already immersed in the story within seconds, which eliminated the need for traditional exposition and allowed each episode to begin with momentum rather than explanation. But the deeper impact extended far beyond efficiency, because the song's distinct bluegrass identity introduced millions of viewers to a musical genre that had previously been associated with regional culture rather than mainstream entertainment, and that exposure gradually shifted perception, transforming something once considered niche into something nationally recognizable. And this transformation wasn't accidental. It was the result of pairing a simple, memorable narrative with a sound that was both distinctive and emotionally resonant, allowing it to stand out in an increasingly crowded television landscape. And once the song gained traction beyond the show, it began to operate independently, reinforcing the series every time it was heard, creating a feedback loop where the music promoted the show while the show amplified the music. And that kind of synergy is rare because it requires both elements to function effectively on their own while still strengthening each other, turning what could have been a minor production detail into a defining feature that extended the show's influence far beyond television and helped secure its place in cultural history. Number 10. The public domain mistake accidentally made the show impossible to erase. One of the most overlooked turning points in the legacy of the Beverly Hillbillies didn't happen in front of a camera or within a storyline. It happened quietly through paperwork, when a failure to properly renew copyrights allowed a significant number of early episodes to slip into the public domain. And at first glance, that appears to be a damaging administrative error, because losing control over intellectual property typically results in lost revenue, weakened distribution authority, and reduced long-term ownership. But what followed revealed a paradox that few within the industry could have predicted, because once those episodes became freely accessible, they were no longer restricted by traditional distribution systems, allowing them to spread across local stations, low-cost releases, and eventually digital platforms without limitation. And that unrestricted circulation gave the show a second life that existed outside the control of the system that originally created it, embedding it deeper into cultural memory over time. And this is where the cause and effect becomes particularly clear, because while exclusivity protects value in the short term, accessibility expands reach in the long term, and the Beverly Hillbillies benefited from that shift in a way that transformed a mistake into an enduring advantage, ensuring that new generations could encounter the series without barriers, reinforcing its presence long after its original run ended. and in doing so, that single oversight created something more powerful than controlled distribution ever could. A version of the show that could not be easily restricted, diminished, or erased, proving that sometimes losing control is exactly what allows a piece of media to achieve permanence. Number 11. The Clampetts were never the joke the world around them was. At a surface level, the Beverly Hillbillies appears to be built on a straightforward comedic premise, inviting audiences to laugh at a rural family attempting to navigate an unfamiliar and supposedly more sophisticated world. But that interpretation only holds if you remain at the surface, because as the series unfolds, a more complex structure begins to emerge, one in which the Clampetts themselves remain internally consistent while the environment around them becomes increasingly unstable, and that inversion shifts the entire comedic dynamic, because the humor no longer comes from who they are, it comes from how others respond to them, and those reactions begin to expose deeper flaws within the world they have entered, a world governed by status, perception, and fragile social expectations that begin to collapse under minimal pressure. And this is where the show transitions from simple comedy into subtle critique, because by refusing to change the Clampetts, it forces the surrounding system to reveal its contradictions, turning moments of misunderstanding into moments of exposure. And over time, the audience begins to recognize that the characters initially framed as unsophisticated often demonstrate greater clarity, honesty, and emotional stability than those judging them. And that realization fundamentally alters the viewing experience, transforming it from entertainment into reflection, proving that sometimes the most effective way to challenge a system is not through confrontation, but by existing within it without conforming, allowing its weaknesses to reveal themselves naturally over time. Number 12. Buddy Ebsen refused to play a fool, and that saved the entire show. When Buddy Ebsen was first cast as Jed Clampett, the character had been written as a broad comedic stereotype, designed to generate laughs through exaggeration rather than depth, but Ebsen recognized a fundamental structural flaw in that approach, because if every character leaned entirely into caricature, the show would lack balance and quickly collapse into chaos. So he made a deliberate decision to ground Jed, portraying him as calm, thoughtful, and morally centered, and that choice didn't just reshape a single performance, it redefined the entire tone of the series. Because once Jed became the anchor, the surrounding characters were free to operate at more exaggerated levels without destabilizing the narrative, creating a controlled contrast that allowed humor to expand while maintaining coherence. And this shift introduced a more sustainable form of storytelling, where comedy emerged from interaction and tension rather than constant exaggeration, and that balance gave the show longevity, because it allowed for variation, development, and evolution rather than repetition, and this demonstrates how a single performance decision can create a ripple effect across an entire production, transforming what might have been a short-lived concept into something enduring. And without that grounding presence, the Clampetts could have remained one-dimensional figures, but by introducing restraint, Ebsen created depth, and that depth became the foundation that allowed the series to resonate far beyond its original premise and maintain its cultural relevance over time. Number 13. The animals were more controlled than they seemed, and that was the illusion. Ellie Mae's connection to animals appears effortless, almost instinctive, as if she exists in a world where wildlife naturally responds to her presence without hesitation. But behind that illusion lies a highly controlled system built on training, coordination, and precision, because every animal that appeared on screen had to operate within strict behavioral parameters to ensure consistency across takes, and that level of control was essential to maintaining production schedules and avoiding unpredictability. Yet the goal was to conceal that structure entirely, allowing the audience to perceive these interactions as spontaneous rather than orchestrated, and achieving that effect required careful planning, where each movement was subtly guided to appear natural, creating a seamless integration between performer and environment. And this hidden structure contributed directly to the credibility of the character, because Ellie Mae's identity depended on that connection feeling genuine, even though it was carefully constructed behind the scenes. And this reflects a broader principle in filmmaking, where the most effective elements are often the least visible, supporting the narrative without drawing attention to themselves. And in this case, the animals weren't just background details, they were extensions of the character's personality, making their reliability essential to sustaining the illusion, proving that what appears effortless on screen is often the result of meticulous design working quietly beneath the surface to create something that feels real. Number 14. Rejection didn't close a door, it quietly redirected an entire career. When Bea Benaderet was passed over for the role of Granny, it might have appeared, on the surface, as a missed opportunity tied to a single casting decision, but in reality, that moment triggered a chain reaction that extended far beyond one show, because in Hollywood, casting is never just about one role, It is about positioning within a network of relationships, creative partnerships, and future projects, and by not fitting the specific physical and tonal direction required for Granny, Banattaret was instead redirected into roles that aligned more naturally with her strengths, which kept her within the orbit of the same producers and creative minds, and that continued association eventually led to her involvement in projects that expanded into their own successful series, effectively turning what seemed like rejection into strategic repositioning. And this is where the deeper cause and effect becomes clear, because if she had been cast as Granny, she may have become permanently associated with that single identity, limiting her range in the eyes of the industry, much like what happened to others who became inseparable from iconic roles, but by not being locked into that image, she retained flexibility, allowing her career to evolve in ways that extended her influence across multiple productions, and that outcome illustrates a recurring pattern in Hollywood where the absence of one opportunity creates the conditions for a broader one, and in this case, the ripple effect didn't just benefit one performer, it contributed to the expansion of an entire creative ecosystem, reinforcing the idea that in entertainment, success is rarely linear, and what looks like a closed door is often a redirection towards something larger that only becomes visible when viewed in hindsight. Number 15. The show ended not because it failed, but because success was redefined. By the time the Beverly Hillbillies was canceled, it had not lost its audience in any meaningful way, and in traditional terms, it remained a successful show with strong ratings and a loyal following. But the decision to end it was driven by a fundamental shift in how success was measured, because the television industry was entering a phase where total viewership was no longer the primary metric, and instead, networks began focusing on specific demographic groups that advertisers considered more valuable, particularly younger, urban audiences with higher spending potential, and this change created a disconnect between popularity and strategic value, where a show could dominate in numbers but still be seen as misaligned with the future direction of the network. And that is exactly what happened here, as the Beverly Hillbillies attracted a broad, often older audience that didn't fit the emerging advertising model, making it less attractive despite its continued success. And this marks a turning point not just for the show, but for television as a whole, because it represents the moment when content decisions began to prioritize market segmentation over mass appeal, reshaping the kinds of stories that would be told moving forward. And in that sense, the cancellation wasn't a failure of the show, it was evidence of its position within a changing system, where the rules had shifted beneath it. And that shift carries a larger implication because it demonstrates that longevity in entertainment is not determined solely by audience connection, but by how that audience fits into evolving industry priorities, meaning that even the most successful shows can become vulnerable when the definition of success itself is rewritten. In the end, the Beverly Hillbillies wasn't just a sitcom, it was a mirror reflecting how quickly success can shift, how illusion can define reality, and how simple characters can expose complex truths. Its legacy reminds us that authenticity outlasts trends. If this changed how you see the show, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss what comes next.